The smallest oxygen tank anyone had ever seen in the Family Feud studio belonged to 6-year-old Mason Williams, and it followed him everywhere with a quiet mechanical rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his shortened life. Wheeled behind him on a miniature cart that his father had painted bright red to make it look cool, the tank delivered the extra oxygen that Mason's damaged heart could no longer pump efficiently through his tiny body. Standing at the studio entrance that Tuesday morning, Mason looked like any other excited child about to appear on his favorite game show, except for the pale blue tint around his lips, and the careful way he moved to conserve the energy his failing heart struggled to provide. David Williams, Mason's 34-year-old father, pulled the oxygen cart while keeping one protective hand on his son's shoulder, monitoring every breath with the hyper-awareness that parents of critically ill children develop out of necessity. Sarah Williams, Mason's mother, carried a medical bag that had become their constant companion. Emergency medications, backup oxygen canisters, and the carefully folded paperwork that documented Mason's place on the heart transplant waiting list, where he'd been for 8 months, with no guarantee that a compatible donor would be found in time. The Make-A-Wish Foundation had expedited Mason's request when his cardiologist had quietly suggested that waiting might not be an option. His wish had been heartbreakingly simple. He wanted to meet Steve Harvey and play Family Feud because, he'd told the social worker, Steve Harvey makes everyone happy, and I want to feel happy before my heart stops working. In the green room, Mason sat very still in his chair, the oxygen tube trailing from his nose to the small tank beside him, while other families buzzed with nervous energy around the craft services table. He didn't have the stamina for the excited movement that usually characterized children about to appear on television. Instead, he watched everything with the kind of focused attention that children develop when they've learned that energy must be carefully rationed. Sarah occasionally adjusted Mason's nasal cannula or checked the oxygen flow rate, small gestures that had become as automatic as breathing. David kept glancing at his watch, not from impatience, but from the medical necessity of tracking Mason's energy levels throughout the day. They had learned to read the subtle signs, the slight bluish tint that appeared around his fingernails when he was working too hard, the way his breathing became shallower when he was tired, the careful stillness he adopted when his heart was struggling to keep up with the demands of simply being awake. Steve Harvey approached the Williams family during the pre-show introductions with his characteristic warmth, but something about Mason immediately commanded his full attention. In decades of hosting, Steve had met children with various challenges, but the sight of this 6-year-old connected to medical equipment, sitting with the composed dignity of someone much older, triggered every protective instinct Steve possessed. "Well, hello there, champion," Steve said, kneeling down to Mason's level with the careful respect he reserved for moments that felt more important than entertainment. "What's your name, buddy?" "Mason Williams," the boy replied, his voice soft but clear, slightly breathy, from the extra effort required to speak around the oxygen tube. "I'm 6 years old, and I love watching you on TV." Steve's smile was genuine, but his trained eye was taking in details that troubled him. The medical equipment, the way Mason's parents hovered protectively, the careful stillness of a child who had learned to conserve energy for survival. "I see you've got some special equipment there, Mason," Steve said gently, indicating the oxygen tank without making it seem scary or unusual. "Does that help you feel better?" Mason nodded seriously. "My heart doesn't work right, so this helps me breathe. Daddy painted it red because red is fast. Like race cars." David stepped forward slightly. "Mason is waiting for a heart transplant, Steve. This is actually his Make-A-Wish." The words hit Steve with more impact than David probably intended. Make-A-Wish requests typically came from children whose conditions were serious enough that wishes needed to be granted quickly before time ran out. Steve's expression shifted subtly, his entertainer's mask giving way to something more human, more real. As the family took their positions for the actual game, the production crew made accommodations that broke Steve's heart. They positioned Mason's oxygen tank behind the family podium, where it wouldn't be visible to cameras, and they provided a small platform so he could reach the buzzer. But even with these adjustments, it was clear that Mason was working much harder than any 6-year-old should have to work just to participate in a game show. The Williams family was competing against the Johnson family from Texas, but from the opening moments, Steve found himself focused more on Mason's stamina than on the usual flow of competition. The child was clearly giving everything he had to this experience. But everything for Mason was a carefully limited resource that had to be managed like a precious commodity. During the first 2 rounds, Mason surprised everyone with his sharp answers and quick thinking. When Steve asked for things you might find in a doctor's office, Mason confidently buzzed in with stethoscope, earning the #1 spot on the board and a celebration from his family that was both joyful and heartbreaking in its intensity. Each small victory felt magnified because everyone present understood how much effort it cost Mason to achieve it. But Steve's trained eye noticed troubling details. Mason's breathing was becoming more labored as the game progressed, and the slight blue tint around his lips was becoming more pronounced. During commercial breaks, Sarah would quietly adjust his oxygen flow or offer him sips of water, small interventions that suggested Mason was working at the limits of his physical capacity. During a commercial break before the final round, Steve watched Mason lean heavily against the family podium, his small chest rising and falling with the visible effort of breathing. The boy was clearly exhausted, but he was also clearly determined not to let anyone see how much he was struggling. It was a kind of courage that Steve had rarely witnessed in his decades of television. The courage of someone fighting to appear normal when normal was no longer possible. Sarah knelt beside her son, quietly checking his pulse and monitoring his breathing in the way that parents of critically ill children learn to do without appearing medical or alarming. David adjusted the oxygen flow slightly, small gestures that spoke to a family that had learned to navigate crisis with practiced grace. The final round arrived with the Williams family trailing slightly but still in contention. Steve announced the category with his usual enthusiasm, not knowing that the topic would create one of the most profound moments in Family Feud history. "We asked 100 people," Steve declared. "What's the most important thing about your heart?" It was Mason's turn at the podium. He stepped forward with the careful movements that had characterized his entire appearance, the oxygen tank following behind him with its quiet mechanical breathing. His small hands gripped the podium edge for support, and he looked up at Steve with eyes that seemed to carry knowledge that no 6-year-old should possess. Steve repeated the question, his voice unconsciously gentling. "Mason, what's the most important thing about your heart?" For the first time during the entire taping, Mason hesitated in a way that seemed different from normal contestant consideration. His pause was longer, more complex, and Steve realized that this question carried personal weight for the child that went far beyond game show strategy. Mason looked at his parents, then back at Steve, then down at his chest where his damaged heart was working so hard to keep him alive. When he finally looked up again, there were tears in his eyes that he was trying very hard not to let fall. When Mason finally spoke, his voice was even softer than usual, barely audible over the studio's ambient noise, but every word carried across the silent space with perfect clarity. "My heart is broken," he said simply. "The doctor said it doesn't work right, and if I don't get a new one, I might die." The studio fell completely silent. Not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for the next laugh, but the heavy silence of hundreds of people collectively processing something too profound and too heartbreaking for immediate response. Steve's professional composure cracked visibly. His smile vanished entirely, replaced by an expression of such genuine pain that it was clear he was no longer hosting a game show. He was simply a man confronting a child's mortality in the most public way possible. "Mason," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion he wasn't trying to hide, "what do you mean when you say your heart is broken?" Mason's response was delivered with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes display about their own medical conditions, but the content was devastating in its simplicity. "It doesn't pump right," Mason explained patiently, as if he was teaching Steve something important. "The doctors said I was born with it, not working good, and now it's getting worse. That's why I need the oxygen, and why I get tired, and why I'm on the list for a new heart." Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that defied every producer's expectation and every rule of television production. "Stop the music," Steve called out, his voice carrying an authority that immediately silenced everyone in the studio. "Stop everything right now." The Family Feud theme music cut out abruptly. The cameras continued recording, but every crew member understood that they were no longer producing entertainment. Steve walked away from his podium toward Mason, his movement deliberate and protective, like someone responding to an emergency that only he could see. The studio audience watched in complete silence as Steve approached this 6-year-old who had just articulated his own mortality with heartbreaking clarity. There was something about Mason's calm acceptance of his condition, combined with his obvious determination to have this one normal experience, that transformed the atmosphere from entertainment to something much more sacred. Steve knelt on the studio floor in his expensive suit, his attention completely focused on Mason, who stood beside his oxygen tank, looking impossibly small and fragile under the bright lights. "Mason," Steve said gently, "tell me about this new heart. How does that work?" Mason's explanation was delivered with the kind of medical knowledge that no child should possess, but which children with serious illness often acquire out of necessity. "I'm on a list," Mason said simply. "When someone dies, and their heart is good, they might give it to me if it fits, but it has to be the right size and the right type, and they have to get it to me really fast. My doctor says it might happen, or it might not." Steve's eyes filled with tears as he realized the full scope of what Mason was facing. A 6-year-old boy whose survival depended on another family's tragedy, who had learned to live with the knowledge that his future was completely beyond his control. "What do you want to happen, buddy?" Steve asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mason considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything, then looked directly into Steve's eyes. "I want to get a new heart so I can run and play like other kids," Mason said. "And I want to thank the family who gives it to me. But Mommy says I can't because it means someone else got sick." The simple wisdom in Mason's response, his understanding that his life depended on another family's loss, demonstrated a level of emotional maturity that left Steve struggling for words. Here was a 6-year-old who understood the complex ethics of organ donation better than most adults, who carried the weight of knowing that his survival would come at the cost of another family's grief. Steve Harvey had hosted thousands of shows, had made millions of people laugh, had built a career on bringing joy to others through entertainment. But sitting on that studio floor with Mason Williams, he found himself confronting something that transcended anything he'd ever experienced in television. "Mason," Steve said, his voice breaking slightly, "I want you to know something. Your heart isn't broken. Your heart is perfect. It's the strongest heart I've ever met." Mason looked confused. "But it doesn't work right. The part that pumps blood might need some help." Steve explained, "But the part that loves, the part that makes you brave enough to come here and play this game, the part that makes you think about thanking families you'll never meet, that part of your heart is perfect." Steve began removing his suit jacket, the gesture that had become his signature in moments when entertainment gave way to ministry. But this time, as he wrapped the expensive garment around Mason's tiny shoulders, the symbolism felt particularly powerful. The jacket hung like a protective cloak around the child, and his medical equipment, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most important moments in television happen when the cameras capture something real and unscripted. "This jacket," Steve said, loud enough for everyone in the studio to hear, "has been with me through thousands of shows. But today, it belongs to the bravest person who's ever stood on this stage." Mason pulled the jacket tight around himself, and for a moment, the oxygen tank and the medical equipment seemed to disappear. He was just a 6-year-old boy wearing a grown-up's jacket, feeling special and protected and celebrated. "Mason," Steve continued, "I want to make you a promise. I'm going to call some people I know, some doctors who are very good at helping hearts, and I'm going to make sure that you get every chance, every possibility, every hope that exists." Steve pulled out his phone and made a call right there on stage, in front of everyone. "Dr. Martinez, it's Steve Harvey. I'm standing here with someone very special who needs our help. A 6-year-old who's waiting for a heart, and I need you to move heaven and earth to make sure he gets every resource, every opportunity, every chance that exists." The call was brief, but clearly significant. When Steve hung up, he had one more thing to tell Mason. "That was one of the best heart doctors in the country," Steve explained. "And he's going to make sure that you're not just on a list somewhere. You're going to be a priority." But Steve had one final gesture planned. He turned to address the entire studio, the audience, the competing families, the crew members who had stopped their work to focus on what was happening at center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced, "this game is officially over. Not because anyone lost, but because we just met someone who reminded us what winning really means. Mason Williams didn't just answer a question about hearts. He taught us about courage, about hope, about what it means to keep fighting even when the fight seems impossible. The applause that followed wasn't typical game show celebration. It was something deeper, something that acknowledged the profound courage it had taken for Mason to share his truth on national television, and the grace with which he carried a burden that would overwhelm most adults. As confetti fell and celebration music played, Mason stood in the center of it all, wearing Steve's jacket like royal robes, his oxygen tank beside him, his family surrounding him with love and pride. The medical equipment that had seemed so prominent at the beginning of the show had somehow become just part of who Mason was. Not a limitation, but simply another aspect of a remarkable child who had taught an entire television studio about the true meaning of strength. 2 months later, Steve Harvey received the phone call that made him stop everything he was doing and sit down. "Steve, this is David Williams, Mason's dad. I wanted you to be the first to know we got the call. They found a heart. Mason's surgery is tomorrow morning." Steve's eyes filled with tears of relief and hope. "How is he?" "He's scared, but excited," David replied. "He wants to wear your jacket to the hospital. He says it makes him feel brave." The surgery took 14 hours, but it was successful. Mason's new heart, donated by another family facing their own unimaginable tragedy, began beating strong and steady in his small chest. When he woke up in the ICU, the first thing he asked for was to call Steve. "Steve," Mason said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, "my new heart works really good. And I want to thank the family who gave it to me, but the doctors say I can't know who they are." "That's okay, buddy," Steve replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "Your heart knows who they are. And somewhere, that family knows they gave their gift to someone very special." 1 year later, Mason Williams walked onto the Family Feud stage again. This time, running towards Steve with the boundless energy of a healthy 7-year-old. The oxygen tank was gone, replaced by a broad smile, and the kind of vibrant health that comes from having a heart that works perfectly. "Steve," Mason called out as he ran into a hug that lifted him off the ground. "Look how fast I can run now." Steve held Mason tightly, remembering the fragile child who had taught him about courage, about hope, about the power of love to sustain us through the darkest times. But this healthy, energetic boy was proof that sometimes miracles do happen, that sometimes hope is rewarded, that sometimes the bravest hearts get the second chances they deserve. The jacket that Steve had given Mason became a symbol of hope in pediatric cardiology wards across the country. Other children, waiting for transplants, began asking for brave jackets during their treatments. And eventually, Steve's foundation partnered with children's hospitals to provide special jackets for young patients, each one labeled with a simple message, "For the brave hearts who remind us what courage looks like." Mason kept that original jacket hanging in his bedroom, not as a memory of being sick, but as a reminder of the day when a game show host looked past medical equipment and saw the perfect heart that had always been beating inside him. And every night before bed, Mason would touch the jacket and remember that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and showing up anyway, just like he did on that unforgettable afternoon when he taught an entire television studio that the most important thing about your heart isn't whether it works perfectly, but whether it's full of love. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten, because sometimes the most profound answers come from the smallest voices, and sometimes the most broken hearts are actually the strongest ones of all.